Welcome to The Explainer. Our goal is simple. We dig into the source material itself to help make sense of complex topics. So, today we're tackling an opinion piece from the outlet Shasta Unfiltered. Now, this article has a really strong take on the recent student protests. It digs into what's causing them and what the fallout is. Our job here is to really pull apart its arguments, piece by piece.
Here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the wave of protests the article is talking about. Then, we'll get into the escalation and the risks it highlights. After that, we'll examine what it calls the indoctrination argument. Then, there's a pretty strong charge of hypocrisy, and we'll finish up with its call for accountability.
All right, let's jump right in. To really get this, we first have to understand what events this article is even about. The whole thing kicks off by describing this trend of student-led walkouts, all aimed at U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. So according to the article, things really kicked into gear in late January 2026. It says that right after the administration expanded its enforcement policies, we saw a whole string of protests pop up. The author specifically zooms in on what happened in Minnesota and Los Angeles, incidents that, ended with arrests and even violence. Okay, so that's the what. Now let's get into the how. How does the source actually describe these protests? Well, the author's core argument here is that these aren't just peaceful demonstrations anymore. They're escalating and becoming, really dangerous for everybody involved.
And to back this up, the first big example the author points to is an event in downtown Los Angeles on February 13th.
So what happened there? The article says a student walkout turned violent. It reports that protesters were hurling objects and that 3 federal agents were actually injured. And the author makes a point to really underscore the serious legal trouble these students were in, reminding readers that, hey, assaulting a federal officer? That's a felony. All right, from LA, the article moves on to Minnesota, using it as another key piece of evidence for this whole escalation argument. And here, the focus is a little different. It's more about property damage and just the sheer number of arrests. The source says 26 protesters, students among them, were hit with charges like riotous conduct after things got heated with police. But then the article takes a much more serious turn. It brings up the tragic deaths of 2 protesters in Minneapolis. The author presents these deaths as the terrible and, in their view, avoidable human price of these confrontations getting out of hand. And this is a point they're definitely going to circle back to. So, okay, things are escalating. But why? What does the author think is the root cause here? Well, according to this piece, these protests aren't just popping up out of nowhere. The argument is that the real cause is found inside the schools themselves. So if it's the schools, then who exactly is fueling all this? Well, the article points the finger directly at teachers' unions and school administrators.
The argument goes like this. The big national teachers' unions, the AFT and the NEA, are accused of being really vocal against ICE. The article claims they use supercharged words like terror when talking about enforcement. And when you combine that kind of language with actions like organizing teachers to patrol schools, well, the author says you're basically pushing students towards this kind of high-risk activism.
And check out this quote the author uses. It's meant to capture a specific incident at a high school in Issaquah. The article describes a scene where students supposedly mobbed a parent. The author labels this mob intimidation, not protest, and uses it to raise some serious questions about whether the school is actually keeping everyone safe. All right, so from specific incidents, the author starts to zoom out. This is where the argument gets bigger, moving beyond just schools into a critique of how the public and politicians are responding. The core claim here is that there's a huge hypocrisy going on. To make this point about hypocrisy, the author pulls out some data. We're looking at a number here, 6,744. According to the source, that's the number of sexual assault charges filed against undocumented immigrants in Texas over a 13-year span. So why these numbers? The article uses these stats on homicide and sexual assault to make a very specific argument. It's saying, look at these numbers. Where is the proportional outrage for these victims? The author then brings up well-known cases like those of Lake and Riley and Kate Steinle and basically asks why the same groups protesting ICE aren't out in the streets for them.
And that leads right into this historical comparison the author draws. The argument is that, back in the Clinton and Obama years, there was more community cooperation with federal agencies, which meant fewer big confrontations. But today, the article claims, you have over 500 sanctuary jurisdictions that don't cooperate, and the author's point is that this forces ICE to use more aggressive tactics, which in turn leads to the dangerous situations we're seeing.
So where does this all lead? Well, the article pulls all these threads together for its grand finale.
a direct call for accountability.
And here's the author's final argument, laid out step by step. First, it links sanctuary policies directly to those aggressive federal responses. Then, it throws in that many of these protesting schools are actually struggling academically. The author then calls on parents and teachers to get their priorities straight, focus on safety and education, not ideology. And it all wraps up with this really stark warning about using kids as pawns in adult political games.
So at the end of the day, this opinion piece from Shasta Unfiltered leaves us wrestling with this really big, provocative question. What we've done here is peel back the layers of the author's argument. We've seen how they build their case, that these student protests are more than just civic engagement, that they're a symptom of something deeper. And it all boils down to this. Where do we draw the line between civic education and political indoctrination?